Good evening and welcome to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. I am Beth Hessel, the Executive Director. On the screen, you also see Tess Galen, our events coordinator, who helps make all of this possible and to run smoothly. Behind me, if you are new to the Athenaeum, is our reading room, the wonderful space where our members get to come to work and read, to check out books, to engage with one another. We also have our special guest on the screen tonight, who I will introduce in just a moment. If you know the Athenaeum, you know we are a community of people who are curious, who are thinkers and learners, who are doers and dreamers. We are people who love literature and the arts, the built environment and history, who love to learn together and talk together. We are delighted that during this extended time, we have been able to join together virtually, and we look forward in the fall to being able to start coming together live as well in person so that we can talk face to face. And so our guest speakers can also see our faces and all of your beautiful faces during their talks. If this sounds like a community that you would like to be a part of, we invite you to look into us. We will have information online on the screen at the end of the program so that you can go to our website or give us a call or email us and find out more about becoming a member and a part of our lively community. We'd love to have you join us wherever you are in Philadelphia or around the world. I want to give you all a little reminders about Zoom. If you are on a computer, a laptop, or with a monitor, up in your upper right-hand corner, you will see an icon that says speaker view or gallery view. You want to have speaker view, just click it till you get what you want there, so that when our guest is speaking, you will see her face, and she will fill the screen. That will give you the best experience possible. And at the bottom, if you are on a computer, I can't speak for mobile items because they all appear differently, but you should have the Q&A and chat icons. The chat icon works really well for sending out your kudos to the speaker. The Q&A is the best location to put any questions you have anytime during tonight's program. I will be looking for those to moderate during our Q&A time. If you are not able to find the Q&A icon, go ahead and put your questions in the chat and I'll look for them there as well. At this time, I would like to introduce to you our special guest tonight, who, as Tess pointed out, is kind of leading off our several week series looking at history and events around the world. Professor Nina Rattner Gelbart is Professor of History and Anita Johnson-Wand Professor of Women's Studies at Occidental College in Los Angeles. She's the author of 2 prize-winning books, Feminine and Opposition Journalism in Old Regime France, and The King's Midwife, A History and Mystery of Madame du Coudray. Women of the 18th century France are her passion, although she has taught classes on the French and Haitian revolutions, history and film, herstory, and the history of science and medicine. Her passion, in addition to her work on female journalists, midwives, and scientists, includes her ongoing project learning about Charlotte Coudray. It is wonderful tonight that we get to learn about some little known or forgotten female scientists of the Enlightenment in France. So I would like to invite you to join me in virtually welcoming Nina Gelbart to the Athenaeum. The podium is yours, and at the end of your talk, I will be happy to moderate the questions. Welcome, Dr. Gelbart.
Okay, thank you so much, and greetings to all of you nice folks out there who I can't see, but I know you're there, and it's very, very wonderful to have this opportunity to talk about my work. So I appreciate the invitation very, very much. So I want to start just by saying that I was a very lucky kid. My parents were teachers. They were high school teachers in New York City. My dad was a music teacher. My mom was a teacher of languages and art. And I was an only child, so they took me everywhere. We traveled all over the place. And I was just very, very lucky in that. And I remember all these years that we would go over to Europe and I would be taught about certain kinds of things. We would go to many museums, we would go to many concerts. I got a sense pretty early of sort of what happened when. I would always insist with my parents that they they give me some sort of timeline so that I could situate things. It's probably a little weird for a kid, but I was just already very interested in that kind of thing. What was a sequence of events? And so they taught me a lot of things, and I saw for myself and heard for myself in the music a lot of things about the different periods in European culture. And somehow or other, even before high school, I was just drawn to the Enlightenment, and particularly to the French Enlightenment. My mother was born in Belgium and spoke French to me. My dad was American, spoke English to me. And so what was it about this period that interested me from a very, very early age? It was these wonderful ideas about progress and about science and about reason and about tolerance. And somehow, although we went to Greece and studied that wonderful stuff also, and we talked about the Renaissance, and we went to the Vatican, and I mean, I was pretty familiar with the various periods in European history, but it was the Enlightenment that just had this incredible magnetic draw for me. And then, of course, the revolution, that just sounded so absolutely fascinating. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. This was just so wonderful. And by the time I got to college, I was thinking about these things still more. And this fraternité idea began to bother me. I thought, where are the girls? Where are the women? They were clearly there. But why weren't they being talked about in these books? Why wasn't I seeing their art in the museum? Why wasn't I hearing the music they composed? And so, without having been radicalized in any way by my parents, this was just a question that sort of naturally occurred to me. Where were the women? Fraternité is all very well and good. Working on the Encyclopédie, which was this magisterial venture for, it involved some 200 men contributing articles to this wonderful work. All of that, and the science that was being done, the Academy of Science, which of course a male bastion. These were wonderful institutions, but where were the women? What were they doing? They were surely there. What were they doing? So early on, I became sort of determined to answer that question, to find them, and then to tell their stories, to bring their stories into the light, to resurrect them, if you will, because they had been not only there, but active, and they had been forces to reckon with in their day. And then they had become obscured by the process of history writing. The custodians of culture, almost all male, had decided who was important, who was not important, what kinds of things should be preserved, what kinds of things should be curated. And the productions by women tended to just fall by the wayside. So the first book I wrote was on a newspaper called the Journal des Dames. The title was sort of cumbersome, Feminine and Opposition Journalism in Old Regime France. And then the subtitle was the Journal des Dames. There was, in fact, a newspaper called the Journal des Dames. Isn't that an extraordinary thing? A magazine for women, a paper for women. And I thought, wait a second, what could be in such a thing? Who were the people who wrote such a thing? So the first book that I wrote was the story of this newspaper, 3 of whose editors were women, extraordinary women. One was an actual radical feminist. I will read to you because I use it as an epigraph in my book. If I can quickly find it, something that she had to say, and it was this. Whoops. It was this. Let it be firmly resolved that women will henceforth be enlightened and intelligent. Courage, women, no more timidity. Let us prove that we can think, speak, study, and criticize as well as any man. I await this revolution with impatience. I will do my utmost to be the first to precipitate it. Men everywhere are being forced to recognize that nature made the 2 sexes equal. This is a female journalist, the first female editor of the Journal des Dames, and that's what she thinks. And she said so, and it was in her newspaper. Nobody had written about this newspaper, which lasted 20 years. And that was a pretty long lifetime in the Ancien Regime for a newspaper, because they would come and go. Okay, so that was, my first book was what a friend of mine calls a press biography, because I guess I write biographies, that's kind of my thing. Okay, and the next book, The King's Midwife, that was mentioned in my introduction, was about this extraordinary woman who was a midwife in Paris, along with about 200 other midwives in Paris. And she distinguished herself to such an extent that the king, basically, this is Louis XV, gave her a commission to travel throughout the country and teach the latest obstetrical practices to throughout the realm in an effort basically to avert infant mortality, nothing less. That was the job she was given. Okay, so she traveled throughout France for 3 decades, went to about 40 different places. I traveled her, I followed her around. I went to archives in not 40, but about 30 places that she went. And I thought her story ought to be told. That's quite an incredible thing, I thought. And again, she was somebody who was mentioned occasionally in some little compendium of famous women. Her birth date was wrong, her death date, everything was wrong. But it did say that she had invented an obstetrical mannequin, that she had written a textbook. And I thought to myself, wow, I want to read about this gal. And then when I tried to, there was nothing on her. So I thought, okay, I have to write her story. And so that was a tremendous amount of fun. And then this book is the story of 6 women in 6 different fields of science who were absolutely fascinating, who were very well known in their day. And again, were just sort of written out of history. So that's what I do. I write about these women who I think deserve to be brought back into the limelight. Now, biography is a very old form, invented by men, of course. And the sort of cradle to grave, womb to tomb narrative told by a very sort of omniscient voice from on high. The life unfolds, it all makes perfect sense. That form, that genre, has been sort of exploded. And Caroline Heilbronn, writing a woman's life, was one of the first people to sort of examine what it means to write a woman's life. It's not a tidy thing. It doesn't go neatly from beginning to end. It doesn't make perfect sense. It has all sorts of twists and turns. It has all sorts of obstacles thrown in its way. Mary Catherine Bateson, a bunch of people decades ago started to question this, and feminist biographers since then have really taken this form of biography, of life writing, and given it a new kind of vigor. And part of that has been letting the teller kind of come into the frame. So what I mean by that is a biography is the story of a life written by someone else. It's not an autobiography. And so the someone else who's writing that biography and who's telling that story gets involved with the subject matter and with the subjects. I certainly do. So it comes almost naturally to take some liberties with this form, this biographical form, which, as I say, has been around forever and ever. It's not even necessarily a deliberate effort, but it just sort of happens. So let me just give you an example from my earlier book, and then I'll talk about this one. So Madame du Coudray, the midwife who traveled around for 30 years teaching obstetrics in all of these little provincial cities, I was able to find, because it was an official mission, because the king had sent her, the king's administrators in all these different provinces had to keep records of her visit. And so I found hundreds of letters. I had a wealth of material for that book. Letters to her, letters by her, letters about her, administrators from the different provinces communicating laterally with each other. What do I do with this woman? She's coming here. How was it when she was in your town? Fascinating things like that. And she herself went on this odyssey for about 30 years. And I got so involved in the sort of immediacy of her adventure that book came out in the present tense. Now, that's sort of not how people write history. So I kept changing every is to a was. And I did this for a very long time. And then I finally decided that this was, as the French say, plus fort que moi. It was stronger than I. This was just how the book wanted to be written. So that book is in the present tense. And it's also does not have the canonical chapters that one expects in an academic monograph. It has dateline entries, what she experienced in each of these places where she went. And I got very involved with her personal story. And so that, again, is a very unorthodox biography, but that was just how it came out. And I stopped fighting it. Now, with this one, there are 6 individual chapters. Sorry, there are 5 chapters, but there's 6 women. There's a mathematician, there's an astronomer, Then there's a middle chapter which has two different botanists, and I will tell you in some more detail about each of these women. And then there's an anatomist, and then there's a chemist. And they were very, very different women. I had to work on them in very different kinds of ways. I needed to go, in the case of the midwife, I had to go to all sorts of provincial archives. In this case, I had to work at the School of Pharmacy archive. I had to work at the Observatory archive. I had to work at the Academy of Sciences archive, botanical archives at the Jardin des Plantes. I had to work at the École de Médecine, the medical school archives. Depending on what field these different women were in, I had to find stuff in all these different places. And once again, this book took me longer than anything else. I mean, this took me between 15 and 18 years to write, around my day job, of course. I'm a professor, but it's because I ended up finding much more than I expected to about each of them. And I got, once again, very involved in them, very personally involved in them. So this book has, again, an unorthodox structure, because after each of the chapters, I write a letter to the woman. These are called interludes in the book. And this is me writing to the woman. I don't expect an answer. I don't get an answer, but I write to them and I pose questions that I think my reader would also pose. Things I just simply wasn't able to figure out as I did the research. So I want to get those questions out there, because I'm sure they're in the mind of anybody reading the book too. And then I also want to bring the women up to date. I think it's important for them to understand that they're being known now and that they have a legacy. So let me just give you one example. The astronomer, and again, I'll get into some more particulars about each of them. But the astronomer should know, I think, even though history made every effort to erase her, that there is now a lunar crater named for her, and that there is an asteroid named for her, and that as of very recently, there is a street in Paris named for her. And so I tell her these things in the letter. And so each of the chapters is followed by a letter to that particular woman. And also I tell them about each other. Two of them knew each other very intimately, in fact, but the others I think should have known each other. And there were academies for men to get together and do all this fraternizing. There was no place for women to do that. Kindred spirits, like-minded inquirers about nature. And so I in my mind, I had this society of these 6 women, each contributing a certain skill. And of course it's imaginary, but I wanted very much to just interject this possibility. Had they known each other, here are the kinds of cross-fertilization and things that might have occurred. So this too is a book that doesn't quite follow the rules, but it just was the way I wanted to write it. Okay, so how did I learn about these women? I got glimpses, by the way, during this very long period that I worked on this book and did research in France, and a little bit in Geneva and a little bit in England, depending on where I needed to go for each of them. But it wasn't the kind of crazy traveling that I did for the Midwife book. This was much more Paris-based. How did I learn about them? So I mentioned already the different archives. There were many men who wrote about these women, which was extremely helpful to me. At the beginning of the book, I have a section called Actors in a Supporting Role. And the reason I did that was because these really are the women's stories. These chapters are the women's stories. It was said a while back that you could just sort of add women and stir and you would get a different kind of mix. But when you just add women and stir, it might add a little bit of spice, but it doesn't really change the whole picture. If you instead focus on the women, and then as you pan out, see the different men who were sort of in their orbit, who were drawn to them for various reasons. That's an entirely, bringing the margins to the center, that's a very different kind of thing. And that's what I was determined to do. So there are men in this, there are absolutely men in the story, and they have to be there because some of them were my conduit really to these women. Franklin, for example, talked a lot about 2 of the women. Diderot was a huge supporter of the Anatomist. So I needed what these men said about them. That was hugely important for me. But the story is the women's story. So besides what men said about them, And these actors in a supporting role, of course, these are very famous people: Diderot, Franklin, Rousseau, Jussieu. Most of us know Jussieu as a metro stop in the Paris subway, but Jussieu was one of the great botanists at the time. He was hugely important for one of the botanists that I talk about in the book, one of the women. So I don't say Franklin, great statesman. I mention them only in their role for my story, but the focus is completely on these women. So in addition to what the men said about them, and in addition to my sort of, what I was able to find when I scrounged around in these archives that I mentioned before, there's something else that allowed me to tell their story, and that is their actions, their behavior, their deeds, the choices they made. What did they do? Deeds don't lie. What did they do? Where did they go? Why did they decide to do this thing that they did? And that was hugely revealing of intentionality, even if they didn't write personal stuff about themselves. And only one of them, the last one, actually wrote memoirs, and I'll get to that. So these are the kinds of building blocks that I needed to put their stories together. So let me tell you now a little bit. I'm sort of watching the time here. A little bit about these women. It's a challenge to write about women in any period, but in this period too. There's a lot, but some of it isn't relevant. And then when you really want to know, when you really want to do your detective work, you have very limited number of clues. So you put the story together, you put a story together as well as you can. And I insisted with the Midwife book, for example, I called it A History and Mystery of Madame du Coudray, because some other researcher might deal very differently with the same documents, or might actually find other things, who knows, or might determine that certain things were important that I didn't think were important, or might find something, very trivial that I thought was really central. So I don't think there's ever a single story of something, but the stories that I tell about these women are the ones that I was able to put together with as much detail and as much sort of texture as I possibly could. That was my challenge to myself. And that's why there are only 6, because there were some very, very intriguing female characters that I came upon during my research. And then I just couldn't find enough. I just couldn't find enough to really flesh them out. So these 6 became not just interesting for their scientific activity, but also as personalities. And I thought that was sort of a good criterion for choosing my subjects. Okay, 3 of these women had female partners. 2 of them, in fact, chose each other. The other 3 were married. Now, marriage in 18th century France was extremely confining. There was no wiggle room there. Once you became a wife, if you were a single woman, like the first 3 I mentioned, you had none of these constraints. But once you became a wife, you lost any kind of legal rights until you became a widow. And that's sort of an interesting thing too, but that's another story. But as long as you were a married person, your obligation was to run the household, produce as many babies as you could, preferably male. And that was pretty much it. If you were a good homemaker, you got a lot of points for that. But there really wasn't room within that institution to realize any intellectual ambitions that you might have had. And so the fact that 3 of my 6 were married was really fascinating to me, and that they were able to do what they did in any case. And they did it because one of them didn't get married until after her period of scientific activity was over. One of them married somebody who was very complacent. Basically, once she produced an heir and a spare, and even a 3rd son, basically he decided she had done what she was supposed to do, and he pretty much left her alone to do her thing. She had certain obligations because of her rank and station, but she had also a lot of freedom. And the 3rd one, the astronomer, whose husband was one of the royal clockmakers, brought into her home her astronomy colleague to live with them. So it was a kind of menage à trois, very creative, it seemed to me. And this astronomer, male astronomer, colleague of hers, had an independent relationship with the husband because he persuaded him to make clocks that would be particularly useful for astronomers to use. And so that worked out just dandy. And they were in several, I think 5 different addresses together, and he was always just part of the household. So that was kind of a unique way to handle being married. And she did a few other things that were sort of obligations of hers that her concession to being a wife. So she was on an interesting sort of balance being there, but she managed it. So the three who were married sort of defined marriage in their own way so that it suited them, so they were still able to do their thing. 3 of the women were atheists, and the other 3 were quite devout. They were Jansenists. Jansenists were kind of, that's another entire story that I can't get into, but Jansenists tended to be politically somewhat rebellious, and these women were. And they had disputes with sort of institutionalized Catholicism. So it was interesting to me to find that these 3 women were religious, but a religious in a particular kind of way. Okay, so let me just tell you now a little bit about each of them. So the first chapter is on Mademoiselle Ferrand. She was a mathematician whose mathematical papers have not passed down to us. That's pretty frustrating. But what we know is that some of the great mathematicians of the period, the Bernoulli brothers for one, Gabriel Cramer, who was a Genevan mathematician, Clairaut, who was one of the great sort of prodigies of mathematics in France, they were very eager to be in her company. And that says something. That tells us something. It was very hard for me to not be able to get her actual papers. They have disappeared into the atmosphere. But here's the cover of the book. And I just want you to see this image. Is that showing up? And can you see in the background the words de Newton on the book? Okay. This is an image. This is Yale was very nice and put this on the front of the book. I pretty much insisted, but they were great about it. And this Mademoiselle Ferrand, who was an invalid, died when she was 50. She decided as she was dying that she wanted to commission this portrait by one of the great pastelists of the time. His name was Quentin de la Tour. And she wanted to be depicted meditating on Newton. That is the name of the portrait. Mademoiselle Ferrand meditating on Newton, in case you needed to know, because this big tome with de Newton in it really made the title of the thing, I think, unnecessary, but there it was. And she, this was how she wanted to be remembered. She was quite private, but for posterity, this was the statement she wanted to make. And she had to muster all her strength and sit for this portrait. And in fact, it wasn't 100% finished. She talks about it in her testament as still being in the hands of, in the studio of the artist. And he didn't display it actually until the following year. And when he displayed it, he put it up there with several of the very important philosophes, D'Alembert, Rousseau. He put her right in there. He displayed her right in there with some of the great male minds of the day. It was a very interesting sort of part of the salon, the big art exhibit. It was a statement that he made, putting Mademoiselle Ferrand in there. It was just exactly where she belonged, and he did that for her. So I think it's very fascinating that she wanted to be remembered in that way. She chose a female partner, as I said, and she was bold in all kinds of ways. One of the very curious things, and I wasn't altogether able to figure out how this came about, but she for years harbored a very important fugitive in her home. Bonnie Prince Charlie, the pretender to the British throne, was living in her house for years. And the salon of mathematicians and all these other thinkers who gathered around her on some sort of regular basis in her home, she was ill, as I say, she didn't go out very much. had no idea that he was there. There were all sorts of secret staircases and things. I mean, it's just a crazy story. And this was something that she was doing at the same time that she was entertaining and working with these scientists. Then at the end of her years, she became very instrumental in an epistemological treatise by one of the philosophers named Condillac, called the Traité des Sensations, the treatise on the senses. And Condillac acknowledges her for 15 pages in this book as having been the person who got him to sort of think straight, that kind of extraordinary, acute, keen mind of hers. And it was one of the earliest books of I guess what we would call cognitive psychology today. How do we learn? It was more Lockean than Locke. Locke said we learn through the senses. But these two decided that, because Locke also had the certain faculties or characteristics of the mind, like reflection. You get a bunch of sensory input and then the mind reflects upon it. They eliminated reflection. It was nothing but the senses. It was very, very pure sort of sensationalism. And she and Condillac worked on this, and he wrote the book, but she's dead by the time it gets published, and he gives her credit for 15 pages. It's an extraordinary thing. And she, because she had a female partner, had extraordinary freedoms. She was limited by her illness. She was limited by the shortness of her life, although actually 50 years is pretty good for this period. The other women all lived much longer. They were examples of creative aging. They kept busy till the end. It was remarkable. Okay, I better go on to my second lady. So the second chapter, but I mean, again, Mademoiselle Ferrand wanting to be immortalized in this portrait. Studying Newton, to me, that just speaks volumes right there. So Lepaute, Madame Lepaute, was, as I said already, the wife of one of the royal clockmakers. And she arranged to have her astronomy colleague living with them, which was very convenient. She was childless, but she actually brought a couple of nephews, sons of her husband's brothers, to Paris to teach them astronomy. She and Lalande became the sort of intellectual parents of at least one of these nephews, who really did go on to become an astronomer. And this was her way. A married woman was expected to produce children. And one of the things that was supposed to happen, of course, was that the intellectual capital of a family was supposed to be passed on to the next generation. So because she had no kids of her own, she had to do this with these nephews who she brought from the countryside. And she didn't at all consider that an onerous thing or a burden, but nor did it stop her from doing her astronomical studies. So the thing for which she should have been acclaimed right, left, and center was that she did the calculation that made possible the accurate prediction of the return of Halley's Comet. Now, Halley's Comet has a periodicity of 70 some odd years, and it's an extremely difficult question. It brings into the picture perturbations caused by the gravitational pull of Saturn and of Jupiter. And being able to say exactly when this comet was going to return was really a proof of Newtonianism. It was nothing less. And she did a critical part of this calculation, along with Lalande, the astronomer who lived with her, and Clairaut, who was also a friend of Mademoiselle Ferrand in the first chapter. Clairaut is the one who stands up at the Academy of Science and says, in a certain month of a certain year in the sky, this thing is going to appear. And the calculation, incidentally, was a real race against the celestial mechanics that don't wait for anybody, right? A prediction is not worth much unless it comes before the event. So they were calculating like mad for 6 months straight, not eating, not sleeping. She did the lion's share of that. Clairaut gets up and announces it, never mentions her name. If it weren't for Lalande, we really wouldn't know her role in this. But she was centrally instrumental in this extremely big thing. Okay, besides that, she made all sorts of eclipse maps. She studied the transit of Venus. There were 2 transits of Venus, one in 1761, one in 1769. These are sort of paired astronomical phenomena, fascinating things. She wrote papers on the first one which allowed her to get accepted. She was the first woman to get accepted to a scientific academy ever in France, based on these astronomical papers, which are lost. So this is the kind of frustration that one has dealing with things like this. But this was, by the way, not the Academy of Paris. The Paris Academy of Science did not admit a woman until 1979, just so you know. So she was accepted to the Academy of Sciences in Béziers, which is a town in the south of France that has apparently very limpid skies. It's a favorite place for astronomers to do their observations. And she wrote things on this particular transit of Venus, and we don't have those papers. Nobody decided they were important to save. So she was just remarkably courageous, and she stayed active doing all kinds of special sort of almanacs and things like that for navigators, all based on the movements of the stars. Only in the end of her life, when her husband basically began to suffer from dementia, did she stop working and devote herself to him. And this was a very prickly fellow who had never supported her work at all. And so Lalande, the astronomer who was part of the household, basically made pretty clear that he didn't think that the husband was worthy of her. So there's some very interesting stuff that comes out, especially in the obituaries that were written for her after she was no longer around. Okay, chapter 3 is on the two botanists. And here I sort of wove their stories together. So the first one is named Jeanne Barré. She was a peasant, basically, from Bourgogne, who was hired to be governess for the infant son of a naturalist named Philibert Commerson. Philibert Commerson was widowed very, very early. The baby was a baby. And he hired Jeanne Barré, and exactly how this came about, I have a hypothesis, but I'm not at all sure it's correct. It doesn't really matter. Jeanne Barré comes into Commerson's household to take care of this little boy. He is a very enthusiastic, very brilliant naturalist, botanist in particular, but he does other stuff. He did a study of Mediterranean fish for Linnaeus, for example. And they develop a relationship, and she becomes pregnant. She never names the father, but of course it was Commerson. And to avoid scandal, they leave this provincial town where they are. They leave the little boy whom she was hired to be the governess for with the brother of the dead wife of Commerson, who is a parish priest, extraordinarily self-righteous, very disapproving of this new liaison that Commerson has. And Commerson and Barré moved to Paris so that Commerson can be with, he can be in the happening scientific center. And after a couple of years there, a voyage, around the world voyage is planned. And the captain is to be Bougainville. That's a name some of you might be familiar with. And Commerson is chosen as the naturalist for this trip. But meanwhile, he and Barré have become so attached to each other, and she has become so indispensable to him scientifically because he has taught her all sorts of things. Plus, she has taken more botany courses at the Jardin du Roi, which is now called the Jardin des Plantes, that they figure out a way for her to accompany him. She dresses as a male, and she assumes a new name, and she is hired as his valet to be on this expedition. So there she is on the boat. Women are certainly not allowed. This is a Royal Navy vessel. And she is the valet to the naturalist on the boat. Well, I won't go into too many details here. But at a certain point, she is unmasked. This actually happens on Tahiti. It's quite dramatic. And after that, it becomes very embarrassing for Bougainville. By the way, meanwhile, in South America, one of the first stops they make, Commerson and Jeanne Barré together discover a plant which they name for the captain of the expedition, Bougainville. And guess what? That's the bougainvillea that we all know and love. She found it. So Bougainville decides he better drop off this problematic couple, and he does on what was known then as Ile-de-France, and today it's known as the island of Mauritius off the coast of Africa. And what happens there, I won't go into, but Jeanne Barré's story is a pretty interesting one, to say the least. The other person in the third chapter is a woman named Basse-Porte. She is a botanical illustrator, but also a botanist, coached by Jussieu, whom I mentioned earlier. And her job is to basically capture all sorts of plants while they are still thriving. Many things are sent to the garden that begin to die almost before they open. She has this very essential job. Remember, this is way before photography. So her being able to capture these botanical specimens in illustrations was scientifically very important. She never went any farther than any of the royal chateaus. She went to Versailles, she went to Compiègne, she went to Fontainebleau, she went to Bellevue, she went, wherever the king or Madame du Pompadour, his favorite, called for her to illustrate something, she was there. But here's Jeanne Barré, who goes around the world, and Basporte is a different kind of botanist, a garden botanist, basically, who's doing these sorts of botanical illustrations at home, and who is scientifically very knowledgeable also. She also turns out to be an extraordinary scientific networker. She seems to just know everybody. She gets everybody in touch with everybody else. So these two women are extraordinary in their own right. The fourth chapter is on my anatomist, whose name is Biéron, Marie-Marguerite Biéron. And she is the daughter of a pharmacist. And at a certain point, she is sent to the Jardin du Roi to take art lessons from Basporte. Basporte is always teaching various young girls. Often they're orphan girls, but in the case of Biéron, her father's dead, but she still has a mother. And she comes to work with Basporte, but Basporte very quickly realizes that this girl is not really interested in flowers and is not particularly gifted at drawing, but she's a great sculptor. And she's interested in the human body. I mean, she's the daughter of a pharmacist, and she's grown up with all this. And she has two older brothers. One's a pharmacist, one's a surgeon, and this is her thing. So Basporte directs her toward modeling, anatomical modeling. And that is, in fact, the career that Biéron does for the rest of her life, again, through the revolution until a very advanced age. She creates these she does hundreds and hundreds of dissections over her lifetime. She creates these anatomical models of all sorts of body parts. And she opens a museum so that she takes tours through there, and her anatomical museum is known throughout Europe. People come to Paris and it's one of the must-see things on their list. And she does these demonstrations for the public, for the group, that accumulates, that sort of gathers each day. She also gives individual lessons. And to whom? Well, to a bunch of girls, to teach them about their body, to teach them about reproduction. Again, pretty extraordinary. And she teaches the philosophes. Diderot, D'Alembert, these famous names, took courses from her, which they say taught them more than anything in the amphitheaters taught by men. And another thing is that dissections were forbidden in Paris. Real dissections on real cadavers were forbidden for half the year because they rotted so fast. This is, of course, before any sort of refrigeration, preservatives. And so she can teach all year round because she has these amazing models of all the body parts. And the model, so it's a very innovative pedagogical tool. And the substance, the substance that she used was of her own invention. These models did not melt. They did not break. They didn't even crack. So surely there was some wax involved, but she added resins and feathers and stuff that made them somehow indestructible. Franklin couldn't believe it. He visited her museum. They became very good friends. There's a correspondence, luckily. I actually have some letters that she and he exchanged. And she became a couple, actually, with Basporte, her teacher, the botanist. So Franklin, for example, would send them a gift, the two of them, a gift as a couple. And others also spoke of them, in pretty much the same breath. So she is pretty fascinating. And as I say, she lived into the revolution. And the revolutionary authorities were desperate to get the secret of her indestructible formula, which went to her grave with her as a kind of poetic license or something. I mean, I think that's kind of exciting. And then the last person, I'm getting very close to the end of my time now. Chapter 5 is on a woman named Madame Thiroux d'Arconville, an aristocrat, a high society lady, extraordinarily wealthy even before her marriage because her father was very rich and she married someone still richer. And she was a chemist. She studied anatomy and a bunch of other things, but she was a chemist. That's what she loved most. And what did she decide to study? Putrefaction, rotting, decay, the boundary between life and death. Okay, she would take organic substances, pieces of meat, eggs, whatever, put them into various solvents and see what had preservative power and what did not. She did these experiments. She had labs in her Paris mansions. She had labs in her estates in the countryside. She had a husband who basically left her alone to do this. As I said, she produced 3 sons. He didn't have much to complain about. So she did her thing, which must have seemed extremely bizarre, but he let her do it. But she wouldn't have let him forbid her. I mean, she was as strong-willed as any of the others. What's interesting about this woman is that she always published anonymously. The first thing she did, she had 3 sons, but while still a teenager, incidentally. She married at 14. And then she decided she was going to teach herself languages. So she did. She taught herself English and Italian. She translated all kinds of science. She wanted to read them in the original. And then she translated them into French, always anonymously. And when she wrote her own treatise on putrefaction, that was the name of it, it was anonymous. And everybody that she worked with, every other chemist who knew what she was up to, was sworn to secrecy. They could never reveal her identity. She was not interested in, she didn't need fortune. She wasn't interested in fame. And she was just determined to get this information out there. She did science for the sake of science. In fact, she thought that a lot of women brought down ridicule upon themselves by trying to seem smart. And she just wasn't interested. She didn't want any of the personal credit for this whatsoever. So her whole story is pretty fascinating. And at the end of her life, she dictates 12 volumes of memoirs, which you can imagine after I've told you about the struggles of, how you learn about folks like this. These 12 volumes of memoirs were like a feast for me. They were lost for 2 centuries, and then they surfaced just about maybe 15 years ago, and they were authenticated right away as hers. And I got access to them, and that was just fabulous because I think more than any of the others, I really know something about how, what made her tick because of this personal kind of writing that she did. And she says and she wrote many things, by the way. She wrote fiction, she wrote moral tales, she wrote histories. She was a real scholar, but she said her true love always was her work in chemistry. And she thought of herself as a scientist. So just to finish, as you can tell, I was drawn to these women just because I found them profoundly fascinating as 18th century figures. But I think their stories have tremendous relevance to girls going into the STEM fields today. Now, were they going to be willing to read about things that happened 250 years ago in France? That I can't predict. But the stick-to-itiveness of these women, the perseverance of these women, the tactics they use to find play in the machine, places where they can, spaces where they could do their thing, rhythms that would allow them to somehow not make so many waves that they would be shut down and still get done what they wanted to do. Each of them had an idiosyncratic way of doing that. And for girls going into the STEM fields, and even more importantly, women who are in those fields, they need all the encouragement in the world to stay in those fields, because what happens is they get lost along the ladder. And there's all sorts of very, very disturbing research about this. You see the number of females at the sort of technician level, and then you look to see how many of them are directors of research, and the numbers fall off absolutely dramatically. So I feel that these stories are really relevant for today. And that was one of the things that motivated me to write these letters and to sort of update the women, because at the same time, I'm updating my potential readers. So I'm going to stop. I think I've taken too much time.
Thank you, Nina. This is wonderful. As one of our guests tonight, Karen, said she loves she loves your talk. She says she wished she could attend one of your classes. She'll definitely read Minerva's French Sisters after a long, difficult day. This was perfect to hear this interesting presentation.
Oh, that's so nice.
So the fascinating lives of these women really comes through. So appreciate that. Invite anyone with questions to put them in the Q&A. I think we'll start first. It seems like, except for one of these women, there was really a class-based issue here, like maybe access to learning and education, and curious how did these women get their education so that they could become astronomers or mathematicians, botanists, anatomists, chemists?
Okay, it's not always an answerable question, because certainly there was no school for girls to teach anything of this kind. About Mademoiselle Ferrand, we know that she was tutored in the country where she grew up by a game theorist, by someone who studied probability. And she just hung out with this guy. So when one of the Bernoullis, the very famous Swiss mathematician family, visited her teacher, there she was, this little pipsqueak of a girl who was hanging out and learning about probability from this man who was her neighbor in the countryside. So she, I doubt very much a parent sent her over there. She must have just been somehow drawn to this. And then she cultivated it. And then, once having moved to Paris, she must have found mathematicians with whom she could converse. The Madame Lepaute, the second one, her father was a sort of footman to some of the royal princesses in the Luxembourg Palace. He seems to have gotten tutors for his boys, and she may have just sort of hung out at some of those lessons, but the father was certainly not interested in teaching her. She was very much self-taught. She was apparently a voracious reader as a little girl. But your question is fascinating. Now Jeanne Barré, the peasant from Bourgogne, who gets hired as a governess and then becomes the right-hand person to Commerson, he teaches her. He teaches her botany, and then as Jardin du Roi, she takes more botany lessons, because women were actually allowed to take some of the classes there. So she became knowledgeable in that way. Basporte was the daughter of a wine merchant. Again, there wasn't any sort of intellectual pushing at all in her family. But she first became a portraitist. Then she decided that her subjects were too sort of fickle, and they they always wanted to be made beautiful even when they weren't, and then they wouldn't pay her. And she decided flowers were a much more compatible thing to draw than people. And then flower painting, didn't seem like enough of a challenge. So she decided that she wanted to take this artistic talent of hers and do something scientific with it. So she put herself right in the middle of the Jardin du Roi to learn from the scientists there. So again, these people things were not offered to them on a silver platter by any means. They were motivated themselves to find these things. Biéron was the daughter of a pharmacist. She certainly grew up in a medical kind of atmosphere, and then Basporte really furthered her interest in modeling and in sculpture. But the scientific part she may have already gotten. Her father died actually when she was very young, but she had these older brothers, and she was in the pharmacy shop. And pharmacists, incidentally, in those days were much closer to chemists and doctors than they are today. The membrane was very porous there between those various professions, if you will. And then Thibaut d'Arconville was from a very, very wealthy family, and she was absolutely self-taught. She read voraciously. She writes about this in her memoirs. Her father was very kind. Both she and her sister were very fond of him, but they were bored to tears. And even the little sister bored my lady, because she didn't have the same kinds of interests. So once again, self-taught. And you're quite right that there's a whole sort of spectrum here of class. We go all the way from somebody who's a servant and domestic to somebody who is a great aristocratic lady. And they had their different ways, but they were self-driven without any question. Nobody suggested this kind of work to them.
Thank you. We have another question recognizing that the press in those days was critical for spreading knowledge of cultural events. There's the question if the press in Paris or other cities where these women were active ever print anything of their accomplishments, especially about the woman who created the anatomical museum.
Okay, it's interesting that the question was posed in that way, because she is the one who was talked about in the press. And guess what? She was talked about in the Journal des Dames, which was the subject of my first book. So here was a book, a newspaper devoted to women, in which accomplished women were praised. And one of the things that was praised was the anatomical museum of the Anatomist. The other women were talked about on and off, but not in any kind of concerted way. No particular article was devoted to them. They might have been mentioned in passing. And a lot of the newspapers of the time had these little kind of bite-sized comments on things, or little mini book reviews. So Madame d'Arconville's works were definitely reviewed in the periodical press, but because she was anonymous, she got no credit at all. The books were highly acclaimed, but not the author. And that was her choice.
So this one, I think it's asking if you found any new sources of information about the work that Madame Lepaute did to produce the huge map. My French is horrible. But passage of the shadow of the moon across Europe during the eclipse of the sun, central and annually observed on the 1st of April 1764.
Okay, so she produced this eclipse map, and the question is, how did she do it?
Yeah, I was wondering if you found. Yeah, I guess the question was if you found new sources of information about how she did it, or.
Well, she didn't. The map cartography. By the way, the French cartography was very famous in this period, and so the standard was very high. She did not produce the map that's behind the anatomical drawing that is imposed over it. But what she did was to calculate the path of this eclipse throughout Europe. And she made a line where the eclipse would be full. And then there's a kind of penumbra line on the above it and below it where the eclipse is going to be partial. And then, of course, there are whole areas where this kind of curve of hers doesn't appear at all, because those are areas where the eclipse is just not going to be visible. So there was a great deal of excitement about this. And in addition to that map, she produced one for Paris itself, what the eclipse was going to look like from Paris. And I have an illustration of that in the book. That was less of a, I mean, that was local. That was information that people in Paris would want to have so that they could watch it. And these almanacs that she began, I'm going a little bit beyond the answer to the question, but I just want to say that the almanacs that she produced toward the end of her life, they were annual, and they were about phenomena in the night sky for amateur watchers. I mean, they were also useful, of course, for people navigating, but she was very eager to have astronomy become something popular, something that the person in the street could look up and appreciate.
We have time for one last question, I think. I think we'll end with this one. Was there one of these women that you started writing about first that led you to decide to do the book about multiple women? Or
yeah, thank you for that question. It was The Anatomist. And why? Because I had finished a book on a midwife. And the midwife was actually given a lot of support by a surgeon whose name was Laurent. And at the same time that he was giving the midwife support, because that was my focus, when I was working on that book, he was also helping the anatomist. And of course, midwifery and anatomy are related. So yes, she was the first one who kind of piqued my curiosity. And I thought, okay, let me learn all I can about her. And then I discovered her relationship with Passepartout, the botanist, who was initially her teacher and mentor, and then they had a kind of intimacy, and were known as a couple. And then I began to think, well, that's kind of neat. And I did an article on the two of them. It's still in an anthology that hasn't actually been published yet. And then I thought, okay, who else is around? So then I began my search, and as I say, I came upon more than six. But in the end, what I had to determine was whose story can I really tell? Whose story can I tell so that so that I get across a sort of full-bodied sense of this person who's fitting science into their life in a sort of an uncanny way. This was not common practice in that period. So, but yes, so the conduit was definitely through the Anatomist first.
Well, thank you. And this, you've given a little teaser. So hopefully everyone will want to pick up Nina Gelbart's book, Minerva's French Sisters. Here is the link where you can find it on bookshop.org through the Athenaeum. Portion of the proceeds goes to support local independent bookstores. A portion also comes to the Athenaeum to support our work, so we can continue to present wonderful programming for you. So I hope you'll pick it up. We also have it available at our circulating library for members. So you have several options to get the book. Coming up in programs, I'm guessing is going to be the next slide, as we continue with the Europe theme, keeping house in 17th century England, women in 17th century England. What was it like to keep house? This is part of a larger book that Margaret Lincoln has written, and she'll be coming to us from London. So that will be a wonderful delight. Also, I believe there are still some more tickets available for Jordan Dodson's chamber concert on next Friday evening, The Delightful Flavors of Classical Guitar. He is an amazing guitarist. This will be socially distant, masked, and there's also the live stream possibility too, if you would rather watch it from the comfort of your own home. We have been informed by people who live stream that our live stream programs are of an incredibly high quality. So that is also an option for you. There'll also be on June 8th, noontime talk by Sandy Storlene about the abandoned canals of Schuylkill navigation, based on her research that she did with a Peterson Fellowship from the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. I encourage you to join in at noon for that. You may go online to philathenaeum.org, click on events, and find out more about other programs that we have coming up, both at noon and in the evenings, about our book clubs, about other ways to get engaged and involved. Join, sign up for our weekly newsletter to stay up to date on everything that's happening. We're so grateful to all of you for joining us, and Dr. Nina Gelbart, thank you for joining us. Again, everybody, let us share our thanks, and for joining us from Los Angeles, and wishing you
my pleasure.
Wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you
So much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.